Great. Well, thanks for again, everybody, for taking time out. I know it's very challenging to carve time out of people's calendars and to have this new experience of meeting people face to face, which many of us haven't had for a long period of time. This next session, what I'm going to endeavor to do is distill down a lot of the thoughts that I've had, that the team have shared, that we've had from clients over the course of the some 3+ years that we've been in business, and look forward to the direction that we're heading in as a company over the next 5 years. So some of what I'm sharing with you is in the very near term, and when we cut to Mark's session this afternoon, we'll have an opportunity to see what's in development over the next 18 months. But for now, I'm going to share with you some of the macro level themes that are driving, my thinking, the direction of the company, and the strategy for our business. I'm going to cover quite a lot of detail, and this session, and indeed all of the sessions today, are being recorded. We'll make them available after editing over the course of the next couple of weeks on our site. So feel free to get a recap, share it with your colleagues internally, and hopefully spread the word about our mission as a business. So I'd appreciate that. So if we look at the 3 key themes that I mentioned at the outset, I want to delve into each of them. Just a reminder here. First is our next-gen investors. The second is where we're trying to get every firm that we work with to, which is this nirvana as a neo firm, those new age firms that are taking that digital first approach to meeting their clients' and LPs' requirements head on. And then finally, the use of networks. We have a very network-centric view of the world when we think about our longer-term vision, and so I want to share some of that with you. So let's start with our next-gen investors, and I think it's worthwhile. I'm going to refer to my notes here because it's a little bit of detail. But one of the themes which many of you will be familiar with is this concept of the great wealth transfer that is happening over the course of the next 20 years. Some 68 trillion, according to Forbes, moving from the baby boomers to Gen X and millennials. And about a third of that over the next 7 years. So about early 20s, give or take $1 trillion or $2 trillion. So at a macro level, let's just kind of break the numbers down here. So baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. So that would put them between 57 and 75 right now. There's 71.6 million of those in the US today. They're transferring their wealth to Gen X, and anybody who is a Gen X will know this, but between 1965, if you're born between 1965 and 1980, you're a Gen Xer. That's me. They'll be between 43 and 57 years of age today. And there are 65.2 million of those in the US. And then millennials, anybody who was lucky enough to be born between 1981 and 1996. Any millennials in here? Okay. God, I wish I was you. Millennials born between 1981 and 1996, currently aged between 27 and 42 years of age, and there are 72.24 million of those. So if we aggregate all of those up, first of all, that's where the wealth is being transferred to, 68 trillion. Let's just kind of zone in on that demographic. So in aggregate, that's 137.4 million people, or 41% of the population of the US, that wealth is being transferred to. Now, if we zone in on a next-gen investor, a Gen X who is perhaps digital first, a millennial who is a digital native, they don't know anything other than digital, you've got to, as a firm, think about how those investors think about investing. The first is there's an urgency, there's an immediacy. I talked at the outset about the watchwords for this generation, these multi-generational investors that are coming downstream. That always on, instantly available, streaming now, get me my Uber. I mean, if Uber tells me it's going to be here in 4 minutes and it takes 5, I feel disappointed. I'm questioning, is the algorithm, what's it doing? Is it trying to manage my expectations? I mean, that's how ridiculous it's gotten. But that is the requirement for these digital-first digital natives. There's an urgency and immediacy and a requirement for speed, a 24/7 approach to meeting their needs head on. They want it real time, they want information in real time. If I submit an application or an investment, I want to know where that investment is in the process. As it moves from stage to stage, it's been submitted, it's been accepted, it's under review, KYC and AML is passed, I've been accepted into the fund, a distribution is coming due, a capital call is coming due. I want to know real time exactly what's happening at every stage in the process. So that real-time requirement is something that, I think you'll agree, if we look at the session that Matt held earlier, that dashboard is a real-time view of everything that is happening. What you as a general partner are seeing is what your investors are seeing. So as it moves from one stage to the next, they can see that. As a capital call is issued, they're getting an immediate notification. They can satisfy that notification immediately if they've connected via Plaid. We're removing the friction, and we're also shortening the timeline that it takes to complete that transaction. In many cases, we've seen general partners who moved from an average of 5 or 6 weeks from what we call form to funded. When the initial form came in, through to when it was funded, from 5 to 6 weeks to less than 5 days to get through the entire process. And we think we can shorten that even further. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So that real-time requirement is extremely important. Data-driven. The Gen Xers and millennials are far less likely to use financial advisors than perhaps their parents were. They're looking for information. They're looking to conduct their own due diligence. They want the latest and greatest information. So today, we find it's pretty unacceptable for NAVs to be updated on a yearly basis, although that's very common in commercial real estate and other asset classes. But to get real-time information, the systems are out there. If you step into a building like this, or any modern building, there are IoT devices measuring the use of heating, lighting. I can measure my maintenance fees in near real time with cloud-based systems. I can look at my occupancy rates. I can see payments against rent roll, etc. Why does it take so long to get visibility of the NAV for a commercial real estate asset? That's a question. I think it's going to become even more of a requirement as we move towards secondary markets. So in other words, a secondary market gives you as an opportunity, if you've invested in a fund and that fund is made available through a secondary market for other investors to trade, might be tokenized, tokenized securities. Ultimately, the opportunity for them to participate in that secondary market is only going to be as real-time as the data that supports that transaction. If I have to wait a year to see how an asset is performing, I'm unlikely to pull the trigger right now. I'd like to get the latest and greatest information. So as those markets become more prevalent, I think the urgency of that information is going to become even more important. So that data-driven element and meeting that requirement for those audiences is extremely important. So let's kind of break it down in simplistic terms. I want to take two sides of the coin. I'm going to start with our LPs. So what's wrong with the current process? Well, what's wrong is it's extremely difficult at almost every single stage for LPs to engage. The first level of difficulty comes when you ask the question, how do I find the right offerings? Because for all the right reasons, right regulatory reasons, depending on the nature of your fund, unless you're a general solicitation fund, you can't advertise your fund on your website. You've got to have meaningful relationships. You've got to have a relationship as an LP with an RIA, for example, who can advise you on the fund. There's a lot of friction that takes place in that process. So difficult to find the right offerings. If I do find the right offering, very often, whether it's via email or in many cases still, unbelievably, a PPM with supporting documentation is sent out to you via mail. And once you've waded through the 400 plus pages of the PPM, you have a 30 or 40 page subscription document that you've got to try and figure out exactly where do I sign? What information do I complete? And we've dealt with firms who have close to 90% NIGOs, not in good order. 90%. So in other words, the vast majority of the applications that come through their door are inaccurate, need to be turned around, or in many cases, the individual LP needs to be talked through the document, which, you know, as Jackie will know, and anybody who's got compliance hat on will know that that's really a no-no. You're leading the investor. And yet, it's one of those, I think, dirty little secrets of the private capital space that happens in so many shops, in so many firms. The investor relations team are picking up the phone and they're walking the investor through the form. They're helping them to demystify this document. I mean, incredibly cumbersome. It's a barrier to conducting any kind of trade between your LP and the GP. So that cumbersome activity needs to be neutralized. We'll talk about how we intend to do that. If I'm an LP and I've invested in your fund and I want to invest in another fund, I've got to go through exactly the same process again. You're sending me out more documents, despite the fact you have my information. So can we leverage that to pre-complete the documents? We'll talk about what we do there. Why is there so much paperwork? I mean, for example, in that 30-page document, at any point in time, maybe a third or a fourth of that document is relevant to me. If I'm an individual investor, or I'm a joint investor, or investing as an entity, or investing through my pension. So I've got to try and figure out, much like advertising, 50% of it works. It's a question of what 50%? Well, it's a bit like that with these subscription documents. You know, 30% of it is relevant to me, but I've got to figure out what 30%. So we want to demystify that process and make it easier. The next question I kind of touched on, why does it take so long for me to see how my investments are performing? The immediacy of information, the availability of information, the rails are there and the systems are there, but I'm not sure whether it's that the sector is so distracted by doing deals or evaluating existing investments that it's not really taking care of some of the core, let's say, general hygiene factors, which is how important it is to keep your LPs informed on how those investments are performing. And so, is yearly acceptable? Personally, we don't think so. I think there's a lot that we can do to help firms improve the immediacy of that information. The second, penultimate point here, why are my investments so illiquid? Well, that's a challenge for the private capital markets in general. And there are emerging opportunities with secondary markets and things like the NASDAQ private markets, which is starting to gain some traction. I still think that that's very nascent, and whilst initially we thought we might dip our toe in the water in that, I think it's still very early days. But there will be opportunities, certainly over the next 4 or 5 years, we believe, for those secondary markets to really gain some traction and give people a liquidity option when investing in private capital markets, and I think that's important. And then the final point, why are my management fees so high? Well, there's lots of reasons why it's high. There's a tremendous cost, and actually that cost is increasing, or at least the burden is increasing, as we talked earlier, with the SEC saying, we need you to communicate more, we want more transparency, there's more regulation, you're subject to audits. These are all additional activities, additional costs that need to be borne by the fund, and those costs need to be passed on to somebody, and very often it's the LP. So that's a reasonable question. If we look at the other side of the equation, now these are, if you look left to right here, the counterpoint when you look inside the GP is they're looking for the right investors. So how do I find the right investors? Why can't we make it easier for LPs to invest? In many cases, questions will be asked internally, well, we already know this LP. Why is there so much friction in our process? Can we not remove some of that friction? And sometimes it's just because that's the way it's always been and people are just following process and they have their standard operating procedures and what have you. But I think the expression that people need to bear in mind in this market is that it's not about doing the same things differently. It's about doing different things. And the way in which neo firms think about addressing the client requirement head on is very different to the current thinking that we see in most of let's say, the nascent conversations that we have with prospective clients, less so with our existing clients because they see the light, and we're happy to support them in helping them achieve that vision. Again, when we see these forms come in, if I'm a firm that is 90+%, of course we're asking the question, why are there so many forms coming in that are not in good order? I'm sure people like John here from Grassi, Michael from JTC, this is the bane of your life, right? Documents coming in, they're not in good order. You've got identification, which is blurry. You've got out-of-date documents. And there's so much inefficiency that's built into that process, that back and forth, that it's unreal. And of course, that comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of time and monetary cost. There is also a question for many companies, how do we gather, if we're going to provide more frequent updates and more accurate updates, how do we gather that information? How do we do it efficiently? And so we'll look to help with that. We're going to talk here about the kind of counterbalance that we're bringing to this equation. How do I ensure I've got the capital when I need it? Right, so there is a lot of inefficiency in the capital call process today. There's a lot of chasing. There's a lot of reconciliation that goes into that. We certainly gave an indication of how we're helping to improve that with the plan integration earlier. But then if you, on the one hand, have, as the market does have right now, there's a lot of talk about pressure on management fees. How do I protect my costs, my margins? How do I lower my cost of capital? These are the kinds of challenges that we see when we look at both sides of the equation. We address with our platform both parties. So let's look at how these neo firms are helping to address this. So the first point is it easy to find the right offerings? Well, a combination of our current platform and the asset class network, which I'm going to share some details of here in a moment, it is easier to find the right offerings. It's not cumbersome to invest. So the very first time that you invest, we take you through an easy onboarding process. We customize the journey. It's an adaptive journey. If you're an individual investor, you're going to see a different set of questions than if you're investing through your pension or you're investing as an entity. So we take out all of that opaqueness in the process that exists when they stare at a 30 or 40-page subscription document. We take that out. We take them just through the journey that they need to be taken through, asking just the right questions at the right time. There is no need to re-enter details. Once we've captured that information once and it's in the system, as they move to make another investment, we reapply that information. Their job isn't to re-enter it, it's just to verify that it's still correct. Yes, it is still me. Yes, I still live here. Yes, this is still my spouse, right? So it's about as close to, as we describe, the Amazon one-click experience when you're investing for the second time on the platform, and it's leveraging that data. If that data that you have in the system is correct the first time, it's going to be correct the second time. It's going to reduce those not in good order errors and remove that from the process. We're minimizing the paperwork, right? The documents that you get, rather than being talked through it by the investor relations team, you've been through the process as the investor, you get the documents pre-completed, you review it, you're happy with it, you sign, and you finish. So it's minimal paperwork, and it is digital end-to-end. The next point here, easy for me to see how my investments are performing. We'll talk a little bit about that when we come to the asset class network here in a moment. And also the penultimate point, my investments are liquid. So we are looking actively at some secondary market opportunities and participating in those markets, bringing the ability, first of all, to tokenize your fund. So you have the opportunity through asset class to tokenize your fund in those security tokens to be tradable in these secondary markets. That is relatively nascent. Realistically, we're about a year away, I think, because there isn't enough demand for it, quite honestly, right now. But I think in the next year or so, we will start to see that type of capability come to bear. And then by lowering the cost of administering this end of the market, when I say this end, I mean the retail end of the market, which, as you heard from the panel earlier, is a growing market. And that macro level picture of that movement in wealth means there's going to be even more of them. The private capital markets today are valued, depending on who you look at, somewhere between 18 and 19 trillion. And we know over the next 7 years, there's going to be over 23 trillion in wealth transferred from the old guard, if you will, to the Gen X and millennials. That's a huge opportunity for private capital, a huge opportunity. And if we look at the performance of private capital, despite its current challenges, compared to the S&P 500 over the last 20 years, it's outperformed it, I mean, consistently. So these new investors are looking at private capital. They're looking at increasing their allocation to private capital. There's a huge opportunity there, but only if you can do that at scale. If you have the opportunity to take out the inefficiencies, streamline that process, make it easy for them to invest, then there's tremendous opportunity there. So on the flip side, you can see the counterbalance to it. If I can easily find investors, if I make it easy for them to invest, there's no friction in our process, we've minimized the NIGOs, performance data is available in a timely fashion, I have the capital when I need it, everybody's happy. This is nirvana. This is what we're trying to get to, right? And with the initiatives that we're going to share with you now, we're going to talk about our plan to get you there. Some of it, as I say, is in the near term, some of it is a little bit longer term, but we are, as part of our mission, calling on not just the people in this room, but the broader market in general to come with us to remove these inefficiencies. We all make our living in some way, shape, or form from the private capital markets, and it's incumbent on us, if we see something as obvious and as impactful as removing these obstacles to investment, we should be doing something about it. We should be grasping the nettle, taking and tackling those issues head on. That's what we do as a company every day. It's what our clients do. We're very grateful for you for joining us on that journey. But it is something that if you want to be on the right side of the digital divide that's coming, you've got to do. So let's talk about networks and the significance of networks to our strategy. So we have an internal phrase that we use, which is come for the tools, stay for the network. That's our vision. Coming for the tools means doing what you're doing today. You're adopting the asset class fund operating system. You're dealing directly with your cohort of LPs, your investors. But there's a much broader network of relationships and stakeholders in play, and you can see them here. We have custodians. We have different classes of investors, high net worth individuals. We have money coming from family offices, financial advisors, RIAs, et cetera. Some of them are on the increase, some of them on the decline. But ultimately, to operate, you've got to work across, if not all of these, certainly some of these stakeholders. Today, we sit on an individual client basis at the center of those relationships. We're enabling these third-party sources of capital, the RIAs and family offices and high net worth individuals and institutional investors, to make investments in funds being operated by the GPs. The GPs are taking in those funds. We're interacting with fund administrators to share information on that investment. We're dealing with custodians, making sure that we're providing the information to them in the manner that they are happy to consume and ingest for the purposes of funding those investments. So this is the network of stakeholders that we have to take into consideration, not just for us as a technology company, but for you as firms. You're having to deal with varying degrees of efficiency with each of these. And we think that there's a tremendous opportunity to leverage that network. So for example, with the network effect, if I, as a general partner, place my fund on a network rather than an individual asset class deployment, I have the opportunity to expose my fund to other LPs on the network. And let's just put kind of the metrics into, bring them into focus here. Today we have about 650 funds across the network, about 30,000 accredited investors on the network, representing about 105 billion in assets under management across those firms. Exposing my fund on an opt-in basis to a network gives me an opportunity to expose my fund to a broader base of LPs. Now, the same is also true if, as an LP, I want access to more funds, which, as we know, is a challenge today, addressing the needs on the left-hand side of the slide that I had earlier. How do I easily find offerings? Well, the asset class network will give you an opportunity to participate and to view those funds and perhaps interact with those funds in a far more frictionless manner, should we say. So there are a couple of examples. Another quick example is if we think about the data exhaust, as we describe it, that comes off transactions that are happening across 650 plus funds, 30,000 accredited investors, all of the information that exists around transactions, distributions, performance data, right? That information is available today in a single instance. Imagine what we could do if we can share that information again in a governed, anonymized manner across the network, what kind of insights that would provide. So it's with that in mind that I'm delighted today to be able to announce that we are taking alpha clients, applications from alpha clients to join the asset class network. Just to share with you the core objectives of the asset class network, there's a number of services that we'll provide over time, and we're happy with our alpha clients to delve into this in more detail. The first of which is discovery. So the ability for you as a general partner to make your funds available. You've already created those profiles in your own individual instance. We talked a little bit earlier when Salesforce were on stage here about the technical work that we've been undertaking with them for the last 6 months. What that enables us to do is to create, at the top of all of our individual instances, individual organizations, create a master org, which is the asset class network organization, which means that if you've opted into the network, you can, as you create funds here, you can make those funds available at the asset class network level. What that means is that for any LPs who have opted into the network, they now have visibility of those funds. They can interact, express interest in learning more, register with you, and more importantly, they can passport their investor profile into those new offerings. And what we mean by passporting is that if Greg, who's one of our very valued clients here, if Greg creates a profile once, investing on a single asset class org, opts into the asset class network as an LP, and he now has visibility of all of those funds that have opted in from the GP side. If he decides that he wants to invest in that second fund, rather than having to re-enter his details, he can passport his details into that second fund via the master org. Now that's game changing. It means that Greg does not have to re-enter all of that detail. Now, as we know, when you move from one fund to the next, and we see it every day, one general partner to the next, there's huge inconsistencies around how companies do this. But there are very common groups of data, whether it's individual contact data, investment types, et cetera, that can be easily replicated from one company to the next. So the concept of passporting a profile that we have for Greg in the asset class network and superimposing that on a secondary fund, the overlap is quite large. And so we can take a lot of the legwork out of that, streamline the process for Greg, make sure that the data that's being entered for the general partner is accurate, helping to reduce NIGOs, helping reduce friction in the process, make it easier for friends in the fund administration environment to get higher quality submissions, speed up the rate at which it's processed. This is all part of the vision for asset class powering private capital globally. The next service that you can think of really as a network-based service is the concept of KYC and anti-money laundering, or PEPs and sanction checks, you name it. When we think about this at a network level, there's an opportunity to plug in service providers to the network. So as you onboard a new investor, what we see across our base of clients is differing services that are being employed by each fund, and that's fine, but there's integration that comes with that. In many cases, in fact, there's no integration. It's manual. It's not necessarily as effective and efficient as it should be. There's an opportunity for us to introduce network-based KYC and anti-money laundering. So at the point of submission, you're checked. So Greg, the first time that he invests, can be checked. Not only that, but he can be continuously checked across the network. And so as Greg makes an investment in the secondary fund, that KYC and anti-money laundering credentials can be passed and verified to the next fund. Again, that's part of our longer-term vision for providing some of these network services. The same is equally true for interfaces to third-party applications. Matt mentioned a little bit earlier about our integration with Parallel Markets, InvestReady, around accredited investor certification. These are services that you really want to be able to plug into the network, and we take care of the integration with these third-party services. So it's plug and play. The final point here is that of data insights. And so when I talked earlier about that data exhaust that comes from the tens of thousands of investors across hundreds of funds, and ultimately we anticipate thousands of funds across our network, it gives you the ability to leverage the data insights that come from governed, anonymized data. So here's a couple of examples. If I'm in the commercial real estate sector, perhaps I want to go to the asset class network to get some data insights on how a particular asset class is performing. Is there or a sub-asset class in commercial real estate, how is it performing? Is it weakening? Is it strengthening? Should I be looking at disposing of assets based on information that I'm getting from the network? And we're looking at aggregated data. So the opportunity here is to look at a very large swath of data to help us influence investment decisions that we're making. The same is true if I'm looking at launching a new fund. What asset class am I looking at? What's the demand across the network, across the potential LP base? What am I trying to compete with? What kind of rates of return am I likely to encounter? If I look at the asset class network, I'll be able to see all of that. So these data insights or data insight feeds that we'll make available to participants in the network will have an opportunity to contribute to, but also take from the network. So that's something that we will be working with companies like Snowflake to bring the Asset Class Data Cloud, or ACDC, which I quite like, the Asset Class Data Cloud to bear, no pun intended, to power your private capital. But that's something that is front and center for us and something we're putting a lot of investment in. And again, we hope to bring more detail on that towards the back end of next year. There's quite a bit of work that needs to be done on that, but also you need critical scale to achieve that. And yes, we're a relatively new company, but we are growing quickly. And I think we're getting to the point now where we're starting to get that critical mass in place. Sorry, I did say that was the penultimate point. I mentioned earlier about the secondary markets for improved liquidity. What we're talking about there in aggregate, we're terming internally as open investing. I mentioned the term at the beginning of the session today. Open investing is to the private capital markets what open banking is to the banking markets. It's about removing friction. It's about making the experience far more enjoyable, if you can use that word in private capital. Is it enjoyable to invest in private capital? That would be novel. It's about turning your company kind of inside out and becoming more open as a business. And what we're doing with this open investing initiative is leading the charge. And so on December 1st of this year, we'll be launching, and between now and then we have a lot of work planned around this Open Investing Alliance. This is the second announcement that we're making today. The Open Investing Alliance is designed to address the inefficiencies that exist across the private capital markets, across all stakeholders. So we're looking to work with GPs, we're looking to work with LPs, with fund administrators, with custodians, all of the individual stakeholders that are responsible for and have the opportunity to address the inefficiencies and friction that exists in the process. And so the Open Investing Alliance, and we'll be inviting not just those cohorts, but also competitors of ours on the technology front to participate in the Open Investing Alliance with a view to achieving these objectives. So I'll just go through them very quickly here. The first is, this is basic stuff, but standardized fields for data collection. That would be nice. There's huge variation from one client to the next, from one environment to the next. Standardized subscription forms and layouts. The amount of time and money that's wasted in non-standardized subscription forms. And anyone who's a client of ours will know we have to go through the laborious task every single time of mapping fields to these forms, because the forms change over time, their layouts change over time, etc. And yet there's huge commonality, but you wouldn't think that if you sat down with each of the individual firms, because everybody has their own flavor of forms and layouts. Standardized accreditation questionnaires. One of the frustrations and challenges, I guess, of getting guidelines from the SEC and other regulatory bodies is they are just that, and guidelines are not directives. They are exactly what they describe, they're guidelines. So they're interpreted in hundreds of different ways. So we want to standardize the accreditation questionnaires and, again, make it easy for the onboarding process if we can do that. Consistent and persistent KYC and AML checking, we talked about that. This is about making sure that people feel that they are as secure investing in private capital as it's possible to be. And that means that you have a responsibility. We have a responsibility as a technology company. You, as general partners, have responsibilities for ensuring that the people who are making those investments are good actors, and that we maintain the reputation for this market that we make our living in. Standards to which technology firms like ours, investment firms, fund admins, custodians can adhere to. A published predictable means of data sharing. So if we're going to open an API, as we intend to, from the asset class network to third parties, we want to make sure that that information, first of all, that we can publish it, and in order to publish it, you need to standardize. So that's a key initiative for us. But we also need to recognize national and international standards. So today we have about 85% of our clients are here in the US. We have the remainder are in Europe. We've just closed our first Middle Eastern fund, a $500 million fund in Qatar. They'll be launching in the next 6 months a $50 billion sovereign wealth fund with us. So we are truly an international business. We have an opportunity to help drive the standardization across this space, and we hope that you will join us on that mission and participate in this Open Investing Alliance. We'll be reaching out to everybody who's here today and to our broader audience. We have 120,000 contacts across the private capital space in our database that we'll be reaching out to encourage to participate in this. And so if you'd like to learn more about that, just watch out for the announcement on the 1st of December. We'll be inviting early participants, founding members to participate in the Alliance, and we're excited to see where that will take us. But that is a part of our longer term vision as a business.